Hello again, everyone, and welcome. Again, my name is Dipali Srivastav. I'm the editor of the Energy Explained publication of the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia CEPA. This event, Environmental Justice Movements From Mahad to Today, is the final of our four-part webinar series examining climate and energy justice issues in India and South Asia. Many thanks to the series co-sponsors from across Columbia University for their incredible support in making this happen. Starting with the Ambedkar Initiative, whose convener is Dr. Anupama Rao, and she'll be the moderator of today's discussion. Thanks as well to the Center on Global Energy Policy, that's CGEP, where I work, and especially Kaushik Deb, who leads the India program, and Vincent Antwi, who has impeccably orchestrated all the moving parts of this series. Thanks to the CEPA Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Climate and Engagement Committee. In particular, Dr. Jenny McGill, whose behind-the-scenes support has been invaluable. Thank you also, Columbia Climate School and the South Asia Institute. Having led the programming of this series, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to highlight three key takeaways from our previous sessions before we get started with today's. In the interest of time, I'll pull up the names of all the experts on the screen briefly who presented at these webinars. And then please reach out if you're looking for specific sources and would like to get in touch with any of them. I would also encourage you to see the webinar recordings on the CGEP website if you haven't already. So here are just three things I'd like to highlight from those very rich discussions. And I think these sort of takeaways are more what I thought would be geared towards our audience and attendees. So first, climate justice is a question of caste justice. In considering the humanitarian impact of the climate crisis, not just in global north and south terms, but within a highly unequal country like India, the experts highlighted close connections between caste and impacts of climate change and energy transition. For example, who makes decisions about resource extraction and who faces the associated risks? Who bears disproportionate impacts of extreme weather and high wet bulb temperatures, but lacks coping mechanisms and social protections? These questions are relevant within not just the country or even a city of India, but just within a few blocks of a city, where the affluent minority and the poor live not very far apart, because after all, the poor provide services to the affluent, and yet they lead very segregated lives. Second, who is shaping the narratives? That's a question I often ask as a writer and editor. Oppressed communities by caste and religion might be an overlooked area in India's climate discourse because of the lack of social diversity in higher education and policy-making circles. In fact, one of our speakers called out the elephant in the room, including these kinds of virtual rooms, by pointing to the overwhelming presence of the so-called upper caste among people of Indian descent. So these webinars, I hope, are helping to lead to some introspection and making some contribution to shifting the narratives. Third, and on a positive note, we got some examples of collective agency, whether through laws that allow for local democratic resource control or through looking at adjacent frameworks, for example, for social justice through an environmental lens. Today, as we honor the anniversary of Dr. Ambedkar's Mahad Satyagraha, the importance of this cannot be overstated. I know our two terrific speakers and the discussion that will follow will share a lot more insight on this. So I will not take up any more time, and I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Thomas Crowley is a writer and researcher and currently a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography at Rutgers University. His research focuses on processes of urbanization, industrialization, and socioeconomic change in small-town India, specifically on the town of Mahad. He is the author of the book, Fractured Forest, Quartzite City, A History of Delhi and Its Ridge, on the environmental history and political ecology of India's capital city, where he has lived previously. Dr. Prakash Kashwan is an associate professor of environmental studies at the Brandeis University. He's also the chair of the Environmental Justice Concentration in the Master of Public Policy program at the Heller School of Social Policy and Management. He's the author of Democracy in the Woods, Environmental Conservation and Social Justice in India, Tanzania, and Mexico, published by the Oxford University Press, as well as the editor of Climate Justice in India, published by Cambridge University Press in 2002. He's one of the editors of the Journal of Environmental Politics, as well as the co-founder of the Climate Justice Network. And last but not least, as I mentioned, our moderator today is Dr. Anupama Rao. She is director of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society and the convener of the Ambedkar Initiative. She'll be moderating our discussion. With that, I now turn the floor to Thomas, our first speaker, and thank you again, all of you, both the participants for joining us today, as well as our speakers.
Great. Thank you so much, Deepali, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel and organizing it. Thank you so much to Professor Anupama Rao for moderating, to Dr. Prakash Kaswan for being on this panel with me. It's really a great honor to be part of this series, to attend earlier events in this series. I've taken a lot of inspiration from, the lovely scholars who are on the screen now, so nice coincidence there. And yeah, so it's really an honor to be here on the last of this and to celebrate the anniversary of the Mahad Satyagraha, which I'll also speak about a bit. So with that, I will share my screen. So just give me a moment to do that. Okay. That should be good. Great. Okay, so the title of my talk, as you can see, is Not Just for Water, Elements of Anti-Caste Struggle. Let me also start my timer so I don't take up too much time. Anyway, yeah, so today I want to talk about Mahad and the relationship between caste and water and caste and nature more generally. This was a complex relationship even in 1927 when Dr. Ambedkar led the Mahad Satyagraha. And I would argue that it's even more complicated today in the present day, in part precisely because of the success of the Ambedkarite movement. My talk will look at two water-related issues in Mahad. One is a question of water access, and the other is the question of floods and flooding. In a sense, you could say this is maybe two sides of the same coin, but very different. One is a question of scarcity, maybe artificial scarcity. The other is a question of excess, of overflow, of surplus. And what I want to argue is that looking at Mahad, both in 1927 and in the present day, through the thought and through the praxis of the Ambedkarite movement, can help in constructing an anti-caste conception of nature and environmental justice. And in this, I would want to draw on three arguments or insights from the anti-caste movement and from the thought of Ambedkar particularly. Two of these are critiques of Brahmanism, Brahmanism being the ideology of the upper castes, in many ways, the ideology justifying the caste system. And one of those critiques is a critique of Brahmanical notions of permanence, of fixity, of the eternal. The other is a critique of knowledge production. So precisely what Deepali mentioned of who controls the narrative. I think that's very relevant here as well. And the final insight is Ambedkar's reconstruction of Buddhism. He converted to Buddhism in the last years of his life and constructed what he called Navayana, or new vehicle of Buddhism. And I think all of these insights can be brought to bear on questions of environment and environmental justice. So what I'm presenting today is based on 2 years of ethnographic research in Mahad. Mahad is a small town, population of around 30,000, in the Konkan region of the Western Indian state of Maharashtra. So the Konkan region stretches north to south with the Arabian Sea, as you can see on this map. The Arabian Sea to its west, and to its east is the Western Ghats mountain range. You'll see this arrow is pointing to Mahad. I know it's kind of illegible, but important thing of this is just to situate geographically and to show that it's this yellow part at the top is here listed as Bombay, now officially known as Mumbai, the mega city, which in many ways Mahad is in the shadow of currently. So I lived in Mahad for most of 2022 and 2023, and was able to attend, amongst other things, the commemorations of the Mahad Satyagraha in those 2 years. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it this year, but I want to, at least through the pictures in my slides, kind of bring those celebrations and also just everyday life in Mahad, bring that to life a bit. So this picture here is from March 20th, 2022. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, and for those who are, sorry for the repetition, but the Mahad Satyagraha was seen as this extremely important, seminal, modern anti-caste protest, basically, where Dr. Ambedkar and other people from various castes, but mostly from castes in those times deemed as untouchable, went to this water body, which you see in this picture here, which was in a very central part of Mahad, which was largely surrounded by Brahmin households, and drank water from it. They were traditionally, Dalits were not allowed or prohibited from accessing this water. So this was in many ways seen as launching the modern anti-caste movement. And at least since the 50-year anniversary of this, since 1977, there's been annual commemorations in Mahad, where people come from all over the state and in fact all over the country or even all over the world to be here at these protests. So this is a group of people who have come to commemorate. This statue of Ambedkar was built much later as part of the kind of memorialization of this event. And I thought the headline that was given in the newspaper the day after this event was very interesting, and there are many, many such headlines. So in Marathi, this says, "In Mahad, a great blue wave." And here, the blue wave is referring to the followers of Ambedkar, or those inspired by Ambedkar. As you can see in this picture, many people are wearing blue, which is the color most associated with the Ambedkarite movement. And this metaphor of the followers as this great wave, this ocean wave that's washing over Mahad, I found very intriguing and significant also because I want to talk about water today, not just as a biophysical substance, but as an extremely potent metaphor and as an element, one of the 4 great elements, whose physical and metaphysical aspects are not so easy to disentangle. And this was really brought home to me when I first started working on this project, which was in 2018. I presented on a very, very early iteration of this at a conference at UMass Amherst on the unfinished legacy of Dr. Ambedkar. And I was making a comparison between Flint, Michigan and Mahad and kind of framing them both as environmental justice struggles. And after the presentation, 2 very senior scholars of the anti-caste movement approached me and very warm and friendly, but said, both of them in different ways said, I don't think Mahad was an environmental movement. I don't think you can really think about it like that. And for me, that was really striking. I mean, it changed the course of my research because this question or this comment really, really stuck with me. And I think one of the things they were gesturing towards was also how Dr. Ambedkar himself spoke about the movement and how it's remembered. So this is a close-up of that statue from Mahad, and I mean the text is there in Marathi, but not so legible. But this is the English translation given here. That this struggle, the Mahad struggle, is not just for water. It is for fundamental human rights. So I think this "not just" is very interesting because he's not saying it's not about water. It is about water. But it's, in what way is it about water becomes the extremely important question. So for this, I would turn to the speech that Ambedkar gives in December. So again, I have to kind of quickly unpack some basic history of this, which was that after this March 20th drinking of water, there was an attack on Ambedkar and his followers from a group of upper caste people who basically had heard a rumor that they were going to enter a temple. And so this was thought of as being defiling or polluting. So there's this actual physical violence in which many were injured, and one later succumbed to his injuries. So it was only after that that Ambedkar started to think about Mahad as a satyagraha, as this nonviolent protest that would extend. And massive planning went into a follow-up, which happened in December. And in some ways, the December conference was it was bigger, it was much more radical in its scope and its aims, and that's reflected in Ambedkar's speech that he gives. So I just want to read a little bit from that speech, because it gets into this idea of what is an anti-caste kind of conception of water. So he starts off the speech talking about how bans on intercaste marriage, intercaste dining, intercaste socializing, those are not just limits to sociality, but they, quote, fix the boundaries of each caste in a hierarchical, unequal order. He then says, and I'll read a long quote here, quote, "So much effort is invested in preserving these prescriptions just to maintain the iniquitous order intact. The touchable people of Mahad do not let the untouchables drink water from the Chavdar tank, not because the water would get spoiled or evaporate away with their touch. The reason for not letting them drink it is that they do not want to admit that these castes are equal to theirs. Do not have any misunderstanding that you have been invited by the Satyagraha committee for drinking the water of Chavdar tank. It is not that you and I will become immortal by drinking the water of this tank. We are not dead because we have not drunk the water of Chavdar tank till today. Therefore, if we march to the Chavdar tank, it is not merely to drink the water of the tank. We go there to establish that we are also human beings like others. That should make it clear that this conference has been called to make a beginning towards establishing equality." End quote. So for Ambedkar here, he's describing the logic of the caste system in which matter, in which elements like water get imbued with caste. Ambedkar is trying to demystify this process and turn Brahmanical ideology on its head. Dalits are not polluting because of something ontological in their touch. Rather, the notion of their pollution is imposed on them through an intricate set of restrictions that must be frantically enforced to artificially maintain a sense of inequality. So again, the question is not just about access to water, but it's about all that water is made to bear. And anyway, this picture you see here is from 1966, but this is a more historical picture of Chavdar Tale. And this conception of water that Ambedkar brings is something that's continued with Dalit poetry, which carries forward an Ambedkarite consciousness. And there's a beautiful poem by the Dalit Panther and one of the founders of the Dalit Panthers, Namdeo Dasal, simply entitled Water, from 1972. And in this he writes, "Bravo, bravo, how even water is taught the caste system." And addressing the upper castes, he says, "Your only God colors water with caste." And then, I mean, also the quote you can see here on the screen. And this is not just in poetry, but also just in everyday conversation in Mahad. So the area around Chavdar Tale is still predominantly populated by upper castes. And I mean, I met at least two Buddhists who live there. So now, I mean, it's also very ironic. Buddhist has become a caste marker. Buddhist, which is supposed to go beyond caste, at least in Maharashtra, is associated with Ambedkar's subcaste because they converted to Buddhism in the greatest numbers. Anyway, so I was talking to one of the Buddhist residents of Chavdar Tale, and he shared, one, that it was very difficult even to get the house there. But then he was kind of reminiscing, and he said, quote, "You know, there's this old man, he lives next door. Well, now he's in Pune, but he must be around 100 years old. This old Brahmin, he used to say, the water of Chavdar Tale is ours." I mean, ours meaning the Brahmins. But I said to him, this is the quote still, I said to him, the rain, when it falls, when it pings down on the roof, is that private? Rain is for everyone. Nature is for everyone. Then he was quiet, end quote. So what I want to suggest here is that these are two different visions, two different metaphysics of what water is. And I would emphasize this is not just religious versus rational or a traditional versus a modern conception of water. These are two completely different conceptualizations, which each have a spiritual and I would say a secular component within each of them. And what the image on the left here is basically from a map of Mahad. It's also the map behind me, which I know on Zoom just looks like blank white, but it is a map which is used by real estate developers in Mahad to basically identify plots of land. And what's interesting about it is it's based on British revenue surveys. And of course, there's some minor updates, but basically, one is it still uses old caste names for the neighborhoods. And also, it's not really legible, but you have this big kind of blue square is Chavdar Tale. Below it is Chambar Tale. Chambar is another group that was formerly considered untouchable. So when Namdev Asal talks about building walls around water, I mean, this is very literally happening around water and around plots of land as well. So the question I would also bring is how does this kind of anti-caste metaphysics of water or this way of looking at water, is it relevant? It was certainly relevant in 1927. How do we see it today? And in some ways, precisely because of the progress of the movement, water is in some ways much more open in Mahad. So one example is the Mahad municipality every March and every December makes sure that these water taps are installed so that everyone who's coming in to celebrate these anniversaries can access clean water. And not just in this sort of spectacular festival way, but the Mahad municipality provides water to the whole city, which includes two predominantly Buddhist neighborhoods. So in some sense, you could say water has been democratized in Mahad. But of course, there's always a tension between disruption of the caste system and caste norms and its reproduction. So it gets reproduced in the sense that, for instance, water only came to these Buddhist neighborhoods later, for instance, than the center of Mahad. And I think this tension also plays out in other interesting ways that, for instance, now in 2022, which is when this picture is from, every major political party will support these commemorations on March 20th. So what you have in this picture is on the two sides are two posters from more kind of, you would say, traditionally Ambedkarite groups celebrating this. But in the middle is the Shiv Sena. The Shiv Sena is a nativist party in Maharashtra, part of the ruling coalition at the moment, although that politics is extremely complicated, and that's for another talk. But what's notable here is that the Shiv Sena in its early days, I mean, basically made its name in part through like street fighting and attacks on the Dalit Panthers. They tried to stop the publication of some of Ambedkar's posthumous writings on Hinduism. But now they're very happily celebrating March 20th. I mean, in some sense, you could say, is this just appropriation? But you can also see this as acceptance, as a very widespread acceptance. You would not say in polite company that we should segregate water. It's just not done. You would celebrate this. But what's very interesting is that the Shiv Sena would celebrate 20th March, but they will not celebrate 25th December, which is when Ambedkar gave the speech that I was quoting earlier. And also 25th December is known for Ambedkar and his colleagues burning the Manusmriti. The Manusmriti is an ancient legal text which encodes a lot of caste norms and also punishments for violating those caste norms, as well as gender norms, extremely patriarchal norms. So no major party, and this is not just Shiv Sena, it's also BJP, it's also Congress, it's also NCP. They will not celebrate 25th December. Instead, what you see here, so this is at Chavdar Tale, but instead of something celebrating that, there's this poster that's celebrating the birthday of the son of the MLA, the member of the Legislative Assembly, who's from the Shiv Sena, and whose birthday is 25th December, but they put this poster up on, I think, the 23rd or the 24th. So again, you see this tension between what parts of the anti-caste vision are embraced and which are kind of shunted aside. And thinking about contemporary water politics in Mahad and how they might intersect with caste, I want to move to the second part of my talk. If the first part is around water access, the second is around floods and flooding. And Mahad has always had floods during the monsoon. I mean, as long as there's sort of historical records of Mahad, there's records of flooding. But there's evidence that they have been getting more severe in recent decades. And also that, I mean, this is one place where climate change comes in. They've been getting more severe, and that 2021, which is before I started living there, but just before, in fact. But 2021 was the most severe flooding on record in Mahad. And if you see kind of these, the statue of Mahad, someone told me there that basically up to Ambedkar's midsection, like up to his belt, basically there was water during these floods. Cars got dragged into the tank, into the water tank. So for me, the question is these kind of tools that the anti-caste movement gives us to think about water scarcity, do those equally apply to questions of flooding, to questions of access, which in some ways seem like the kind of opposite problem. And in some ways, these sort of histories intersect in almost overly literal ways. So this sign here, which is in Marathi, basically says, because of the massive flooding of 2021, the water of Chagratale is undrinkable, unsuitable for drinking. For that reason, please don't drink from this. Because traditionally, the people coming to commemorate would drink water from this. So this is the municipality saying, please don't do that. But I think more than this very immediate, and I would say maybe in a sense more superficial connection, there's very interesting questions to ask about what does the flooding tell us about both caste politics, but also class and caste and kind of knowledge and narrative politics in the present day. Because in some sense, I mean, if we go back to this poem by Namdaya Desal, he asks, how will you shackle the rushing form of water? Well, I mean, the floods are in some ways an unleashing, they're an unshackling. And also it is something that if you talk to people in Mahad, I mean, everyone has a story from the flood, no matter what caste, no matter what class, everyone has been impacted by it, especially 2021. I mean, it hit literally every household in Mahad. And just to give a sense of it, this is the view from the balcony of the flat where I lived. The top picture is during the winter, and the bottom picture is during flooding in 2023. Now, 2023 was not considered a serious flood. People were like, yeah, it barely flooded. And you can see how this is the Savitri River, which is what causes the flooding when it overflows. You can see how it just takes over the road. But basically in 2021, it would have been up to the first story or even the second story of some buildings. So in some sense, this seems like a more universal story, at least on the surface. This is something that impacted everyone. But of course, I mean, as you know, people interested in environmental justice would know, it's rarely so clear-cut. And there's a few ways we see this. One is, of course, which neighborhoods are cited in more low-lying areas. So one of the Buddhist neighborhoods is located directly behind where the December Mahad Satyagraha took place. And what you're seeing here, this statue, is basically commemorating that December protest. And this pillar with the flame is representing the burning of the Manusmriti. But this is just a field most of I mean, when there's not flooding. But this is not like a pond, it's become flooded. And this picture is from 2022, where in the common narrative, there was no flooding in Mahad, which is quite striking. Yeah, so I was just trying to make this point that in some sense, even though the flood feels like a more universal experience, there are ways in which the impacts of it are felt along caste lines. I know I don't want to overstate this argument because it's also true that one of the most impacted areas whenever there's flooding is the Bazar Pet, the road where the market is. And that's where a lot of people from the traditional trading caste, merchant castes live. And they're also very severely impacted. So then one gets into more complicated discussions about kind of interrelationship between caste and class. I would also note that it's not just a question of who's impacted immediately, like whose houses get flooded, for instance, but it's also a question of who then can rebuild afterwards, which again goes to the interrelation between caste and class. And what you're seeing here is a picture of a dormitory, basically a boarding house for students who came to Mahad for study. And this was basically started by one of Ambedkar's close colleagues in Mahad, just the year after the Mahad Satyagraha. This is by Subedar Sawadkar. And it had stopped running by the time of the floods, but the building was still in good shape. But basically the floods were the kind of death blow of this. This building, which is really an important part of this history, couldn't recover from the floods in the way that, for instance, the shops of a lot of merchants or traders, not to say they weren't, they didn't incur damage, but they were able to bounce back much more quickly. So in some sense, you could say this is a sort of fairly typical environmental justice story. I think it also gets interesting when one starts thinking about precisely this issue that Deepali brought up of who controls the narrative. So this very typical critique of Brahmanism is that traditionally in the caste hierarchy, Brahmins would control both knowledge production and advising the state. And in some ways, you could say this still happens in many ways. A small town like Mahad is interesting because most of the influential Brahmin families, not all of them, but many of them have moved to Mumbai or moved to the United States or Canada or to Pune. So it's not necessarily the case that it's Brahmins controlling the media narrative in Mahad, but there still is a caste story to it, which I think is quite interesting and which I'll try to outline a bit. What you're seeing in this image are two different stories about what caused the floods. I know the text is not really legible, but anyway, I'll explain. The one on the left is produced by a group of activists and experts who largely came to Mahad from outside, from Navi Mumbai, Mumbai, Pune, and did a series of kind of studies after the flood. And they were able to identify many factors and give the sort of holistic picture of why did the flooding happen. So they pointed to things like changes at the source of the Savitri River. This includes land subsidence, deforestation, landslides, urban change in Mahad, including construction that had blocked the flow of rainwater, the expansion of the city, suburban change, including the growth of an industrial area, which increases both water and air pollution, highway construction, changes to the river itself and to the riverbanks. So this incredibly complex picture of all the factors going into the flood. Now on the right, you have a map that was produced by a committee of local citizens in Mahad who on their own initiative formed this group to try to figure out why the flooding was happening and what could be done about it. This committee included several prominent Mahad citizens, including the city head of the Shiv Sena party, an office holder of the local merchants association, and its caste and caste composition skewed upper caste and Hindu, including several members of the traditional trading castes whose businesses were severely impacted, as I mentioned. And in their explanation, they said, yes, there are many factors, but there's two important ones. One is, and what's shown in the map here, is a bridge built by the Indian Railways, which they said is basically acting like a plug and not allowing water to flow through. So that's a huge factor in their narrative. And also silt, which just over time deposits in the river. There can be many reasons for it, but basically because of this siltation, the volume of the river has reduced, so flooding happens more easily. And in part because it's a simpler narrative, it's just easier to convey. And in part because these were local citizens who had local connections to media, to politicians. The narrative on the right is the one that stuck. And I would say that this sort of narrative is also roughly congruent with the caste and class interests of the people on the committee, on this local committee. And I don't want to say this in some sort of a conspiratorial way, because I spent a lot of time with this committee, and they were clearly very genuine about their research, really going into both historic and present day data, trying to find the solutions, and they were very deeply committed to preventing floods in the future. But I don't think it's a coincidence as well that the recommendations that they came up with did not disrupt their economic and social interests, for instance, in industrialization or in continuing urban growth in the city. And the solutions they came up with kind of fit into existing networks of politics and patronage. So the poster that you're seeing here is basically for the inauguration of works on a security wall that's supposed to help with the flooding. And the security wall, along with removing of silt, which were really the main actions that were taken afterwards. And both of these, I mean, I don't want to say that they didn't do anything. I mean, there was not flooding the subsequent 2 years, and it's hard to say exactly why that is. But even the experts who came from outside thought that silt probably played some role. But the thing about removing silt is it's a very kind of technocratic solution. And it also feeds into, for instance, once you remove that, that can be sold basically as sand to the construction industry. So it fits into these pre-existing circuits of contractors who do this kind of work and can be given a contract again the next year and the next year and the next year. I would just give a brief disclaimer that the sort of caste politics of the Shiv Sena are like extremely complicated, and they have had maybe not Dalit, but other kind of oppressed caste support. So that's a sort of can of worms I won't get into now. But just to say, this control of the narrative is not just what appears in newspapers and all, but has very real political economic effects. And one of the critiques that was voiced by the activists coming from outside was basically that this whole narrative basically actually totally totally occluded those who were most impacted by the flood, which is actually Adivasis or tribal communities who are living in villages around Mahad in the hills of the Western Ghats. So the maximum deaths in 2021 were actually from landslides, not from flooding. And the kind of narrative that developed around Mahad really did not take them into account at all. But at the same time, this critique of the activists, which was, I think, very apt, that also didn't take root in Mahad, precisely because it was coming from outside and they did very good work, but then they went back to Mumbai or Pune, whatever. So for me, the question that this leaves me with, and which I'll try to wrap up the talk with, is then where do we develop a kind of narrative of the flood or a sort of anti-caste politics of these floods that can take into account those most severely impacted by them. And for here, I would take a step back and also change registers a bit in this talk and return to this question of Ambedkar's reinterpretation of Buddhism. And again, this question of the elements. So the 4 classical elements, water, fire, earth, and water, are only mentioned very few times in Ambedkar's book, The Buddha and His Dhamma, which is his vision of his reinterpreted Buddhism. But each time they're mentioned, it's extremely important points in the book. And one of them is precisely when he's talking about this Buddhist notion of impermanence. And here Ambedkar writes that, quote, "The body of a living being consists of the combination of the 4 great elements. And when this combination is resolved into the 4 component elements, dissolution ensues." So basically what he's saying, he's making this argument to reject Brahmanical notions of the permanence of the soul or the eternality of the soul. But at the same time, he's also rejecting another school of thought that existed at the time of the Buddha, called the annihilationist or Uchedwad school. The philosopher Pradeep Gokhale has commented on Ambedkar's Buddhism, saying that Ambedkar gives a materialist explanation of consciousness and of life and death. It's elements coming together and then elements dissolving. But at the same time, he doesn't connect this materialist explanation to the moral skepticism that marked the nihilists or the annihilationists of the Buddha's time. But he ties it instead to a kind of moralism that he derives from Buddhism. And we can see some pieces of that in the quote that I've given here about how shunyata, or this idea of emptiness, does not mean nihilism. It's actually the condition of possibility for anything to emerge. So the pictures I've given here are actually ancient Buddhist caves on the outskirts of Mahad. They're from the 2nd or 3rd century CE, and they've become part of the Ambedkarite pilgrimage circuit. So when people come on 20th March, which you see in the below picture, they also visit the caves. And what's striking is how the monsoon transforms the caves. You can just see the landscape, how it comes alive. So it's because, and Ambedkar, I think, seeing something like this might say it's because of impermanence. It's because the monsoon comes and goes. You can have this change, you can have this vibrancy, you can have this life, and you can have this death. I think the question then becomes, and what's interesting also is Ambedkar is very famous for writing an undelivered speech called The Annihilation of Caste. He's saying precisely caste needs to be annihilated. But by the time of Buddha and his Dhamma, he would still say that, but then it's after the annihilation, then what? You're not purely annihilating. That has to be filled with something. And similarly, when flooding happens, flooding can happen, but it needs to be contained, by the riverbanks, by the floodplains. And what is it that contains that? And I would argue here, it's some kind of notion of Buddhist ethics. Ambedkar says some very suggestive things in the Buddha and his Dhamma. He says, the Buddha did not stop with teaching karuna. Karuna is only love for human beings. Buddha went beyond and taught Maitri. Maitri is love for all beings. And I think, this is something Ambedkar wrote at the very end of his life. We don't know how he would take this, how he would have taken this forward. But thinking about this in terms of the floods and the landslides, I think it does give us a way of thinking about the floods that, of course, would recognize the human suffering, the Adivasis who suffered, the Dalits who suffered, but would also recognize the non-humans who've suffered, who have been affected by all the causes of the flood that were outlined, from deforestation to industrial pollution, landslides, all of that. But then, of course, the extremely difficult question is, how do you move from that, say, more Brahmanical worldview to this Navayana worldview? Ambedkar says something very interesting in another unpublished writing called The Philosophy of Hinduism, which again only gets published much after his death. But he says here, the fundamental condition for the growth of the sentiment of fraternity is not preaching that we are children of God or the realization that one's life is dependent upon others. It is too rational to give rise to a sentiment. And then what I have here in the slide, he continues, the condition for the growth of this sentiment of fraternity lies in sharing the vital processes of life. It is sharing in the joys and sorrows of birth, death, marriage, and food. So this is very interesting because I think this is a tension in Ambedkar's thought, because sometimes, for instance, in Annihilation of Caste, he's saying it's not enough to intermarry. You need to uproot the scriptures. You need to change, that's where the change has to happen. He says there, in the last analysis, you must destroy the authority of the Shastras and Vedas. Intermarriage is not enough. But here he gives kind of the other side of that, where he's saying, at the same time, it's not enough just to say, we're all one, we're all dependent on each other. As Buddhism says, from impermanence also comes ideas of interdependence. But Ambedkar clearly here is saying that we can't just say, and again, I'll read the quote again, this doesn't grow just from the realization that one's life is dependent upon others. We need to share the vital processes of life. And coming to a close here, this is a picture of March 20th from last year. And one way that people contribute to this is to give food for free to anyone who's coming. And this is very beautiful. I mean, many of these stalls set up, giving away food. And yet one still feels the tension that I discussed earlier between the reproduction and the disruption of caste. Because the vast majority of people coming to Mahad on March 20th are Ambedkarite Buddhists, are people coming from oppressed castes. So it is open to all. I mean, everyone is embraced with open arms. Food is given to all. And yet even these celebrations in some sense remain segregated. But I do think this kind of sharing of food, this kind of sharing of the vital processes of life provides some kind of inspiration. And I guess I would ask, just to close out, what would this look like in the everyday, beyond these days of celebration? How would this help us think about questions of water access, questions of floods? Could this help in generating a movement for environmental justice that is rooted in the everyday experiences and the everyday ethics and the histories of places like Mahad? I'll stop there. Sorry again for the interruption. And thanks so much.
Should I carry on, or are we taking Q&As? Okay, all right.
Please, yes. Yeah.
Sure.
Go ahead, Prakash. Yeah.
Thank you, Thomas, for that fantastic talk, and sorry about the interruption, but I'm glad we were back up pretty quickly. Thank you, Columbia, and everybody who's been involved in organizing this series. I just kind of rebroadcast all the nice things that Thomas said and the slide he showed. And I have a particular sense of appreciation for all the efforts that you all have put into to create such an interdisciplinary forum, and from what I understand, a vibrant interdisciplinary program, which is extremely challenging and also, of course, much needed in the current moment. With that, I will start share my screen in PowerPoint so that we can jump right into it. All right, so building on Thomas's such a nuanced and fine-grained view of what's happening in Mahad today and how it relates to the history as well as the broader philosophy of Buddhism and the emancipatory initiatives, I want to sort of zoom out and bring you to an entirely sort of different set of questions that seek to respond to the same set of challenges. And so that is going to be a bit of a rush, and I'm going to sort of try and not belabor too much. But the point is to sort of seek control over the scholarship and the processes of policymaking. Very often, policymaking has been captured by certain disciplines who have a certain orientation, a certain kind of way of understanding the world, which is mostly dominated by economic rationality and the goal of serving the economic production. But I argue that we can't cede that space and those kinds of scholarships and analytics are too important to be left to the devices of those particular disciplines and those particular type of orientations. So my effort has been to wrest control over that part of scholarship and connect it back to the kind of critical social science scholarship and arguments that you heard from Thomas and from the speakers before in this seminar. So thinking about environmental and climate justice, particularly climate justice, I want to start by sharing this path-breaking report that was issued in 1992 by the Center for Science and Environment in New Delhi. And they, without going into too many details, they poked holes in the data and methodology that World Resources Institute at Washington, D.C. was using to minimize the responsibility that the industrially advanced countries had in causing climate change and to sort of blow up the responsibility of what we used to call developing countries then, or mostly now think of as global south. And this report pointed out that those methodological flaws were not an accident, but they were selective appropriation of quantitative methodology to to sort of promote a form of environmental colonialism. This is the finer subtitle of the report, as you see here. And the cartoon basically says, hey, you can't cut this tree because this is going to protect us against the greenhouse gases. So in many, many ways, this report is way, way ahead of its time. But I would argue that an unintended consequence of that advocacy of international climate injustices was that we completely forgot that injustices they grow in real soils on the ground and in every country. And so that whole notion of international climate advocacy and justice discussion, it sort of took on a form of climate nationalism, so that even the climate activists who were certainly progressive in all senses of the word, they were always pointing towards the responsibility of the West and not thinking about how climate injustices may be rooted in both international as well as domestic inequalities. And since that time, the inequality has gone up dramatically. Like you can't imagine. Some of us have been saying this for many years, but now the data shows that India is probably the most unequal country on the planet Earth. And as I was finishing up this PowerPoint, this report came up about a new paper which shows that the top 1% of Indian population controls 40% of all wealth. And this is much higher than the level of inequality that was present in the last 20 years of British colonialism. So we are in a new territory here, and the inequalities are certainly, of course, they come from appropriation of resources, opportunities, and resources of the state as well as society. But most of the times when we hear about climate change in Indian media and the mainstream policy discussions, it's always about the devastation that has been caused. And that is used again to sort of point fingers to the West, which is valid. Those are all the valid arguments about international injustices. But we rarely talk about how, as Thomas pointed out, the impacts of floods and all kinds of environmental disasters, natural man-made disasters are often referred to as natural disasters. And in the Indian sort of way of talking about things, we often also invoke the sort of God's act and all of that kind of natural sort of metaphors. So I would argue that the climate justice advocacy in India suffers from three major blind spots. One, which I already mentioned, that there's a heavy focus on international injustices even today, and there's this sense of climate nationalism, which ignores the fact that climate impacts are not just because of climate change and the floods or droughts or whatever disaster we are dealing with at a moment. Social political injustices and climate crisis are co-produced. We can think historically in terms of colonialism, imperialism, contemporary at the international level in terms of the ongoing neo-colonial forms of global control of commodity production, extraction, and so forth, but also domestically in terms of who gets what within the domestic policymaking arena. And so there is a constant co-production of social injustices and climate crisis. And the vulnerabilities are rooted in deeply entrenched patterns of unequal access to and control over resources, as well as political decision-making and the policy-making processes. So when we focus narrowly on the impact of climate change, we kind of neglect all of this other part of the story of how inequality appears in the form of climate crisis. And finally, sort of derived from that second point is that because of this particular reductionist, narrow understanding of focusing solely on climate change and its impacts, there's always this underlying assumption that if we address climate change, then of course we do justice, because of course climate change is causing injustices. So as long as you're addressing climate change, you're by definition also addressing climate injustices. But by now there's a huge amount of scholarship which shows that many forms of climate action or climate interventions actually reinforce and cause new kind of injustices. So, carbon offsets, which allow the forestry agencies to grab forest land that has been recognized under the Forest Rights Act, or other forms of interventions such as solar plants or wind farms, which capture common land from villages, or sometimes even private land from smallholder and marginal farmers. So this connection between the sort of often unstated but taken for granted linear relationship between climate action and climate justice must be challenged and scrutinized very, very carefully. So with this kind of broader framework, we got together to sort of come up with this edited volume on climate justice in India. And I wanted to read just the first opening paragraph from chapter 1. And this was written during the COVID time. So you see, a reflection of all the ongoing discussions. And Arundhati Roy wrote a very, very well-read and received essay where she compared the COVID-19 pandemic to a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudices and hatred, our avarice, our data banks, bad ideas, dead rivers, and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And of course, there's a great deal of vision here, which we can latch on to and we can build on. But my first thought was that as inspiring and insightful as these words are, this kind of juxtaposition of utopia and dystopia barely scratches the surface of what and who we are as a nation. The soul-crushing images of burning pyres in parking lots, which the media highlighted, offer a great deal of clue, as does the sober poetry of Parul Kakar. You would remember that the poem and the sentiments it conveyed about bodies floating in Ganga. And so India is a land bookmarked with a million fires. And so in the next paragraph, I go on to talk about the underground coal-related fires that have been burning for over 100 years in parts of Jharkhand, Jharia, and other coal mining areas. So we are literally a land with a million fires, and this audience doesn't need to be reminded that these fires, the majority of the brunt of those fires is borne by Dalits, Muslims, and other kinds of marginalized community, Adivasis. And in that sense, what I understood from Srilata Shrikar's sort of path-breaking essay in the volume is that we need to reimagine climate justice as caste justice, as sort of a way of addressing all of these deep-seated inequalities. And I won't go through the whole article. I just love it so much, so I can't stop talking about it. But please do take a read when you have a moment. So now now I'm sort of coming to the central point of this talk, which is to say, how does all of this relate to discussions of economy and policy and politics of policymaking? So I wanted to start by sharing this data which shows the inequality, and the point that I made at the beginning kind of reinforces even more heavily what is conveyed in this data here on the screen, which is that if you look at the first column, which says top 1%, and read from 1960 to about 1980, the concentration of wealth among top 1% was coming down. And then, in the 80s, Indira Gandhi and then Rajiv Gandhi, they started unfolding the neoliberal economic policy program. And from 1990 onward, you see a serious incline in the concentration of wealth, which in 2019 was 21.7%. And the figure that we saw this morning tells us that that concentration has now gone up to 40%. And it's not just because the wealthy have actually captured the share of new wealth that has been generated. If you look at the bottom 50%, which is the last column, you will see that the wealth and the income, that is total income that is controlled by the bottom 50% of population, has been going down consistently from 1980 onwards to this point, and that trend hasn't stopped. Now, we know that there's a cost story here. This is not just about income percentiles, but income percentiles overlap extremely nicely with caste hierarchies and other kinds of social hierarchies in the society. But also, if you want to read, there are some really interesting articles that talk about the crisis of extreme inequality and how it is a deeply casteist crisis. So it's not just an economic crisis or a political crisis, but it's also a social crisis in that sense. Now, what we did in the Hemanti Bhattacharya chapter actually looks at the same story of inequality at the state level, and then relates it to the inequality of carbon emissions from respective states. So what she does in the chapter is that she looks at the relationship between income inequality at the state level and how it related to aggregate of carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions from the state. That pattern was negatively correlated before the neoliberal era arrived, which is that if you had high income inequality in a state, those states were generally very poor states and their emissions were low. So that a small section of population was rich, but they didn't emit crazy amounts, so that the overall emissions of the state were still low. But post-1990, that relationship has turned positive, which means that post-1990, concentration of wealth has gotten so severe that it is also leading to incredible amount of concentration of emissions in the same states that are also extremely unequal. So based on this evidence and many other kinds of evidence that we can bring to bear, I would argue that sorry about that. Right, poverty is not the biggest polluter, as Indira Gandhi famously or infamously said. Inequality is. And drawing on Nandini Sundar's work and many other scholars, both in India and elsewhere, we know that it is the poor people, the marginalized people, who are fighting for the restoration of rule of law. They are the ones who are fighting for the protection of the environment and water and so forth. So inequality is not just socially unacceptable, and it's vulgar in a socio-political sense, but it's also extremely polluting in the deepest sense of the word. So that has a very counterintuitive relationship to the way in which environmentalism works in India. So even though we know that most of our environmental problems are caused by concentration of wealth and power in the hands that don't deserve that control, we rarely focus on the actions of the rich and powerful. Our environmentalism is heavily focused on poor people, and we even have this whole philosophy of environmentalism of the poor. And what it does in a practical way, even though it's commendable in the way in which it draws attention to the actions of poor people to fight for environmental conservation, but it takes attention away from the actions of the rich and powerful, and it focuses narrowly on the actions of the poor people. And in many cases, I would argue that it imposes this kind of unjustified expectation that poor people will take on the burden of protecting the environment. And this reminded me of Dr. Ambedkar's famous lines about the villages. And he said, I kind of shrunk the quote very much, but he says, the love of the intellectual Indians for the village community is, of course, infinite, if not pathetic. What is the village but a sink of localism, a den of ignorance, narrow-mindedness, and communalism? Now, we know, of course, from the work that Deepak Malgan and other colleagues have been doing, that these problems are not restricted to rural areas. Having said that, this love for localism is actually quite central to Indian environmentalism. And in fact, there's not much discussion of it, but this localism relates very directly to the ongoing control of local feudal and neo-feudal families and groups at the local level. So you literally have the His Highnesses of the world setting up NGOs and foundations, getting international funding, and then going to Dalit villages and pretending to support them for water conservation and so forth. And I could say a lot more on this water story, because there was part of my past research was on some of these community-based water conservation efforts. Another important element in the ongoing discussions of water conservation and all kinds of environmental conservation is a reference to traditional water harvesting structure and other forms of traditional practices. And so in the chapter that we wrote for this book, we looked at these kinds of structures in Uttaranchal, and we looked at World Bank supported NGO projects, and we looked at the state government supported NGO projects in Gujarat. And in all of these cases, we found research which shows that these projects and these narratives of local culture and environmentalism systematically always papered over, or at worst brushed aside, questions of caste injustices. In case of a project in Uttaranchal, which was supported by World Bank and run by a prestigious local NGO, they actually grabbed a Dalit's land to construct a water harvesting structure, and their voices were completely brushed aside because this was supposed to be a community project, and maybe the land ownership title was not quite clear cut as happened many times with smallholders and especially Dalits and other marginalized groups in India. So environmentalism in the Indian context is deeply intertwined with the inequalities of caste, gender, religion, and that's why we argue for thinking about environmental justice as well as water justice in a fundamentally intersectional way. And on this occasion of both the Mahad Satyagraha as well as the March 22nd being the World Water Day, I wrote an op-ed which has been republished by a couple of different portals, so please do check out and share away. And so that brings me to continue the discussion that Thomas started on Baba Saheb's speeches and statements around the Mahad Satyagraha. And I wanted to go beyond. Thomas very nicely already talked about, that notion that it's not just about water, but it is about water as well as human rights and life of dignity and so forth. I wanted to look at another sort of aspect of the same speech, where Baba Sahib sort of, made these really, really interesting connections between the sort of deep found love that Hinduism has for other living beings and creatures, while also being so deeply casteist. So just to read it from here, this lake at Mahad is public property. The caste Hindus of Mahad are so reasonable that they not only draw water from the lake themselves, but freely permit people of any religion to draw water from it. Nor do the caste Hindus prevent birds and beasts from drinking at the lake. Moreover, they freely permit beasts kept by untouchables to drink at the lake. They not only treat the harmless cow with kindness, but spare harmful creatures such as snakes. That one Atma or spiritual self dwells in all creatures has become a settled principle of their conduct. Such are the caste Hindus who forbid some human beings of their own religion to draw water from the same Chavadar lake. One cannot help asking the question, why do they forbid us alone? And so this question of love for non-human living beings and a deep-seated hatred and complete disregard for fellow human beings. This continues to be relevant even today. One, because many a times you will hear many environmentalists sort of harping on about these cultural values, we worship the people and all of those kinds of stories. But secondly, more importantly, there's this ongoing movement about rights of nature and rights of non-human species. Now, of course, we have to ask two kinds of questions. One, the one that Babas have already asked, which is that, what explains your hatred for Dalits and, untouchability when you're so friendly to non-human living beings. But also second, who will, if we recognize rights of nature, who other than us is going to ensure that those rights are protected and enforced? And if we were able to enforce and protect those kinds of rights, we would have by now done something about the human rights that are recognized both in the national as well as international law. And obviously, much of this load of demanding for protection of environment and protection of rights falls on the environmental movements. But unfortunately, India's environmental movements, as I already mentioned, are deeply embedded within all kinds of hierarchies. In this particular chapter in the book, I look at three prominent environmental movements, the Silent Valley movement, the Chipko movement, and the Narmada Valley movement. And all three of these movements were largely controlled by upper caste, upper class, middle class, urban professionals, or some of the very prominent social activists. When I made presentations on this chapter, it created quite a bit of negative reactions from some of the authors and people. There's so much of discussion of a sort of a cultural politics of environment. And there are these discussions of bourgeois environmentalism, which talk about cultural politics of environment. All of this is relevant, but none of this can be achieved without the control over the apparatus of the state and the control over real material economic resources. So just as Thomas pointed out, the goal is not to say create this kind of either or binary, but my argument would be that those of us who are focused on environmental and climate justice, social justice, questions of Dalit dignity, dignified lives, and so forth, we must actively intervene in the scholarship as well as in the policymaking processes. And just to share one sort of part of this story of the movements, this is a poem that was written by Bharat Patankar and was translated by late Gail Ambedkar. And this is about Bharat Patankar and other grassroots Adivasi leaders demanding leadership role within the Narmada Bachao Andolan and them not being given those kinds of spaces. So he wrote, "We didn't go to the stage, nor were we called. with a wave of the hand, we were shown our place. There we sat and were congratulated. And they, standing on the stage, kept on telling us of our sorrows. Our sorrows remained ours. They never became theirs. And so by and large, I would argue, and I'm not trying to be unfair to the environmental movement, which has achieved a lot, but if we think about who the environmental movement is led by and gives space to, but also the kind of questions they raise and the way in which it has been framed, where it is all about the green. And then, of course, we can always say, that Baba Sahib talked about water in 1927, Dalits care about environment. So all of those arguments are valid, but they somehow become defensive. And they again sort of have the effect of ceding that space of what is considered to be the standard bearer of who's considered to be the standard bearer of environmentalism. And we need to really dismantle that sort of, hierarchy within environmentalism. So there shouldn't be a Dalit environmentalism. We shouldn't have to argue that Dalits and Adivasis actually care about environment. Of course, they care about environment, right? And the fact that we are having to argue that is actually an indication of how deeply unequal the narratives and the movements of environmentalism have been in India. So I wanted to share this artwork, which was supposed to go into the book, but could not for reasons that I don't want to talk about. But this is an artwork by Dr. Nitin Donald, and he has actually portrayed Earth as a sort of Brahminical upper caste hegemonic project, where you see the sacred Ban Choti also being framed as a tree. And I think this was made in the context of a young couple who was hanged in somewhere in UP. I'm sorry, I don't remember the town. So environmentalism in the global north has been deeply embedded in white supremacist thoughts and control, and I've written about that separately. But similarly, we need to talk about how Indian environmentalism has been deeply embedded in the caste structures. And it's so fundamentally casteist that we need to completely rethink. And of course, these kinds of oppressive structural controls are not just an Indian story. We know about the Black Lives Matter movement, and that then inspired the hashtag and the movement for Dalit Lives Matter. And again, these narratives are extremely important. But as we transport these narratives from one context to another, we need to remember that these solidarities can be helpful in many different ways. So at one level, it's really important to have these kinds of comparisons and these kinds of parallels being made. But as Thomas, and again, I'm thankful to him for sharing that quote from Baba Sahib, where he said that fraternity lies in sharing in the vital processes of life. And so I read that as, how much of life world of the people that we are fighting for, we share. And as long as that sharing is not happening, there's always a disconnect between what we speak for and on whose behalf we speak for. And so that's a note of caution for anyone who is, not living those realities, but then, is doing anything, whether it is writing, speaking, or advocating. And how do our life worlds connect in a way so that there's a better sort of resonance between how we live and how the people who we are fighting on behalf of live. And if that connection doesn't happen, if we can't make that work, then how do we cede spaces to people who should be speaking for themselves, who should be on the stage? And I, in my work, trying to connect policymaking with and the scholarship, policy-oriented scholarship, I draw on inspiration from the work of abolitionist geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She's argued that policy is the new theory. And this quote will again have resonance with some of what Thomas said. Policy is to politics what method is to research. It's a script for enlivening some future possibilities, for opening up new possibilities. policy plays such an important role. And we, of course, in the Indian context, as well as in the US context, we only know at a great cost now that who has control over the political apparatus and policy making can have tremendous consequences. And so we need to build much stronger and much larger bridges between social critique, social theory, critical social theory, and the scholarship and advocacy around policymaking. I have, in a very small way, I've tried to do this. I compared the Adivasi movement in Mahad in central India, who were fighting for protecting their lands against coal mining, with the movements of Apache tribe here in US, who are fighting against a copper mine that is being allowed on their land. And so by looking at these two indigenous movements, one, I try to make sense of where the solidarities are, where the differences are, and how can we actually build on solidarities without losing view of the stark differences on many different planes. So I've tried to devise a couple of different sort of tools that might be helpful, but at the least, hopefully they will be, they will provoke some kind of thinking and further much better research than I've been able to do. One is this framework, which sort of makes the socio-ecological system if you look at the middle green part of the framework here, it talks about a socio-ecological system. So it rejects the binary of nature and society. Water and access to water of Dalits and other women, other marginalized groups is pretty much part of the same system. The pollution of water is absolutely connected to who gets their water from whom. The costing of water is absolutely connected to who's reliant on public water systems. You would be amazed to know that poorest people in Delhi's slums pay about 15 times more in terms of their income for purchasing water compared to the richest colonies in Delhi, who get more consistent water supplies from Delhi Jal Board, so they don't have to pay for private water tankers and so forth. So the socio-ecological system is sort of my focus, and I look at both how the structures of laws, policies, and institutions on the top, as well as the individual and collective agencies of actors on the bottom, how do they connect together via these struggles around resources, environment, climate, and so forth. And this is shaped pretty dramatically by the context within which, so there's the context of race in the US and the context of caste and untouchability in the Indian context, and the way we understand and compare and contrast those kinds of contextual differences has a great deal to say about how we understand the pursuit of environmental justice or climate justice in these different contexts. So this is an overarching framework, and most likely in most cases, no one article or probably no one book would look at all of these things together, but it is sort of meant as a heuristic tool. It's not supposed to be a model, which is supposed to be a much more specific, sort of reductionist, narrow thing. It's a framework which creates a view that then research can significantly, selectively sort of tap into to look at different connections between the context and the political contestation, or between political contestation and the extent to which they have access to policy making and political process and so forth. And these connections, both backward with the context as well as forward into policy making, they sort of feed back into the social system. So you can have a policy making process that advances the emancipatory project, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore is arguing, or you can have policymaking processes that further pushes the marginalized on the margins and forces them into precarious lives and livelihoods. Both ways, it's useful to sort of look at those linkages. And as I said, then you can use sort of look at very specific elements of a particular context. So in the context of environmental justice, I was very interested in thinking about how civil rights laws are talked about in the US context versus how civil rights laws work in the Indian context. And correct me if I'm wrong, but to my surprise, I was shocked to sort of see that if we sort of put aside the constitutional provisions, which is a different sort of set of questions, the actual law in Indian context, civil rights law is related to abolition of untouchability. That's all. We don't have hate laws. We don't have civil rights laws that the law enforcement agencies or citizens can draw on a regular basis without sort of, drawing on the constitutional provisions. So this is just one example of how these differences then shape the opportunities and abilities that social movements and social justice movements have to be able to fight their own struggles in different contexts. So, and I'm coming to the very last part of my presentation here. So the plea here would be that instead of believing in the slogans that, just to confirm, are you able to see the quote on the slide here, or are you seeing the list of slides at the bottom? Could someone please let me know?
Yeah, we can't see a quote on this, just a kind of forest.
All right. I'm sorry. I do know what to do. Okay. And right. Anyway, so there's a quote which says, scientists, corporations, mystics, and movie stars have convinced policymakers around the world that a campaign to plant trillion trees should be the central element of global climate policy. And so you have these babas going around the world protecting trees and protecting rivers and protecting soils. And the point is that instead of relying on these mystics and movie stars, we should actually draw, okay, this is the quote, I'm sorry about that, right? So we should look away from these celebrities and these sort of, powerful people flying around the world and look instead to the movements of marginalized people and those who are fighting on behalf of marginalized people. So, and this is also a good example of where there might be spaces for intervention in the ongoing policymaking processes. So Ashlesha and Kavita, both of them are food sovereignty activists. They compared policies to lease public land to collectives of Dalit women and other women, poor women, in Tamil Nadu and Kerala. Both of these states have some form of these policies. And by providing this comparison, they show how these kinds of interventions contribute to emancipatory dreams of Dalit women and other women, and in some cases men, but they also contribute to food security and climate goals. As many of you know, small-scale subsistence farming, which is less energy intensive, makes use less of fertilizers and pesticides and so forth. It's good for the soil, it's good for the environment, and it also helps protect, sequester carbon in soil because of lack of kind of intensive mechanical tilling that you see in large-scale industrial farms. And in the case of Tamil Nadu and Kerala, these governments have different kinds of policies which actually support these women's groups to adopt agroforestry and agroecological farming. So it is not very difficult to pursue simultaneously these multiple goals of social justice, environmental protection, and climate action. But the problem is not in a lack of opportunities or lack of solutions that will do this for us, but the problem is in who is controlling the narratives of policy making and policy analysis. So in the Indian climate policy scholarship, you will hear a lot about co-benefits. And this is the idea that we will do a top-down industrial centralized climate policy. And by centralized, I mean not just at the central level, at the federal level in India, but also at the state level. And of course, as you know, many of our states are much larger than most of the European countries. And so the notion of co-benefits is that we will do this kind of centralized climate policy, and then there will be some trickle-down benefits because there will be less of pollution, so poor people will be harmed less. That's the notion. And I would argue that we need to reject those kinds of dominant hegemonic policy narratives and actually promote and fight for the kind of policy solutions that will give resources back to people who deserve to have control over these resources, but also aid in strengthening both the political agency of these groups being able to organize and collectively exist and collectively advocate on their own behalf. And so some of these programs are inspired by Deccan Development Society's work, which is a well-known NGO. So many of the NGOs are doing these kinds of work with local groups, and there's a great deal of space and opportunity to be able to do that, as long as we can wrest some of the control back from the dominant actors, and particularly the corporate actors. Also, I think this audience doesn't need to be told, but in the Indian context, many of these big corporations who are responsible for the environmental degradation, now they have also captured the market for the development of renewable energy, whether it is solar energy or wind energy. These same corporations own these new sort of avenues for renewable energy development. And so that's where we have to strike, and again, need to build those bridges and solidarities so that we are able to aspire for and hopefully accomplish the dreams that Babasaheb and other visionaries have seen for the people and for our country and for humanity. I'll stop there and we can get into a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prakash. And so I think the floor is open for Q&A and for comments. Thomas, also, thank you. I think these two contributions really follow very well on each other. And I'll sort of pick up maybe with a couple of things that Prakash, you ended with, and try to go back to where Thomas ended, and then open up maybe for a couple of comments and so forth as we wait for engagement from our audience. But I think there were two things, Prakash, that you ended with. One is, what frameworks exist for enabling laws, especially those that might actually support forms of collective action, various forms of kind of ethicized life-making, if you will, that speak to some of the kind of innovations, some of the experiments on the small scale that you ended with, around enabling communities, really bringing in forms of knowledge, working at scale, and at a scale that's not about, agribusiness and about, kind of maximal capitalization, as it were, of nature. And then the second is, how do we think the connection, for instance, between caste and climate, or any broader form of social inequality? How do we think that connection? How do we actually not just think better, but how do we make a set of connections that may not on the face of it immediately exist? And so I'm thinking about, Thomas's point, and I think certainly, when I was writing about Mahad and the temple entry satyagrahas, and I write about them sort of together, I certainly wasn't. I was thinking about questions of space and spatial inequality and the ways in which a kind of colonial property regime was structuring questions of caste and caste distinction also as forms of, spatialization, right? Spatial practices. But certainly too, I think Thomas's point, of people saying, how is Mahad a climate issue? How does this become a question of, either environmental toxicity, as we get to his comments about flooding and silting and so on? How is it a question either of, toxicity or, something that is related to the question of climate and various new ways of thinking about being together? And there are just a few things. I'm thinking both about a couple of kind of, sound bites that you offered, but also Deepak's, one of the really important sound bites. I mean, it was arresting to me. But, Deepak talked about and used Harvey's argument about accumulation by dispossession, and then adds to that the argument that, but this is also dispossession by discrimination, right? So really creating a kind of, a kind of circular logic for how this really comes to be. And you, I think, will bring up Ruthie Wilson Gilmore's point that, policies to politics, what method is to research, again, to the question, how do we think the connection better? And I think the very important point that you made, which is that, it is not poverty as a kind of form of life or as something that, people experience as an ongoing condition, but it's actually the production of inequality, which always involves, people who have and people who don't. I mean, just to think about an earlier agonism, let's say around labor and capital, or around, nature and society, or indeed here between castes, castes, upper and lower castes. So I think those two questions of, what enabling frameworks might we produce for collective convening, for other forms of, thinking about sociality. And this goes to what Thomas ended with when he, brought up the Buddhist arguments about ethicizing life, which I think Ambedkar is deeply, deeply invested in, certainly by the end of his life. But that, this can cue to, so the idea of Maitri is a kind of, re-ethicization of life and being together, what others will call an environmentalism of the poor, or the question of the commons itself. How do we kind of maybe rethink the commons in the context of caste, and caste inequality is also deeply spatialized. So it seems to me that, these are really, really important questions. And what both of you have brought up is also this, and it's interesting that both of you use poetry as a way to get at maybe making points or making arguments, or really getting to some sense of the deeply kind of ethical, social domain of the questions and their entailments. So, the Namdev Dasal, or again, working within a kind of Maharashtrian rubric, Bharat Patankar's poem about representation. But this idea of, water as being something that is mobile, it flows from place to place, you can't actually capture it. But it's also something that's absolutely significant for one's very sustenance, so-called water wars, and the efforts to actually, claim it, to fix it, to enclose it. And then the other ways in which, water becomes, one way for also thinking about forms and frames of sociality. And so I do want to, I think, Mark, we've been able to capture as close as we ever can, as close as we ever have before, the kind of, proximity between the actual day, the commemoration of March 20th and Mahad, the first Mahad struggle, and then today. So I think that moment of Mahad, what does it really open up? It's both a claim for new ways of thinking about human relation, but it also happens around a deeply material resource, right? And that kind of, the dualism between the material, between, access and inequality on the one side, and the ways in which, we can begin to think about some of these struggles in air as well, and pollution, where many of these things are apparently unseen, but water, of course, is so significant in the logic of caste. I mean, you could say it is the perfect medium, right? Because it is through caste, it is through water that, the most basic kind of elements of the caste structure get created. And more than any other substance, water creates, I mean, everybody can share water except, touchables and untouchables. This would be Ambedkar's point too, right? So it becomes a kind of almost a primal distinction between, castes and those who have castes and outcasts. And so just try to think a little bit about that to mark the significance of the day, it seems to me, and that second moment. And again, I find it very, very interesting and important that Thomas reminds us that the second Mahad Satyagraha, which is, December 26 to 27, is really where the Manusmriti is burnt. It's a second moment. And what has happened in between is actually an act of violence, right? So he goes and, takes water from the tank, Ambedkar does. And in the context or in the aftermath of that, the Chaudhar Tal is purified, right? They put in dung and cow urine and so on and so forth. They purify the tank. And then there's an attack on those who live around the tank and so forth as well, who have dared to go in and take water. So the second satyagraha actually might be the more significant one, or how do we think about, moment one and moment two, as it were, because it's the second one that also can't be commemorated in quite the same spirit as the first one, as Thomas was reminding us, because that is the place where there's a symbolic assault on the entire structure of caste by burning the Manusmriti, which is the organizing framework for the etiquette, the orders of etiquette, ritual, and kind of caste law, as it were. So this was just a way to also, bring up a couple of issues while people were getting ready with their Q&A. We've got one on the screen, and I will read that to you, and you can offer your comments or anything you wanted to say in response to my own comments, maybe also while folding in your responses to those who are actually on the screen asking questions. But there's Yanis Zilagakis. In general, I subscribe to the title Environmental Justice. However, it doesn't seem to me the panel has clarified who is the one committing the injustice. Is it the big techno-financial globalized elites who most likely fund this panel and the Columbia University, which is hosting it, who collect the rents from the exploited, precariat, enslaved labor all over the world? Or is it the local middlemen who deliver products of labor to the markets? Is it the global consumer who buys these products and supports this logistic and supply chain exploitation, wittingly or unwittingly? And I think this is a quite significant question. It's also getting, it seems to me, at the heart of both the inequity of knowledge formation, which I think, Prakash, you brought up in terms of the very structures of how we think about environmentalism. Deepak Malgan certainly also brought this up as a very important framing device for his argument. So there's the inequities of kind of intellectual labor. And then there are the other forms of inequity and inequality that I think our colleague is asking about. I think it's a question for both of you, and it might give you a chance to also reflect on a few other things. So who would like to go first? Thomas, would you like to, so that we can give Prakash a moment to gather his breath?
Yeah, that's quite a lot. So I'll just comment on a few of these. And it's such a thank you, Professor L, for such a rich set of comments and questions. And these are things also I want to continue thinking about and thinking through. About this question of poetry, it's interesting also. So I mean, I'm reading Namdev Desal in translation from Dilip Chitre's translation. But basically, so it's a collection of several works from several collections, but in one of them, the epigraph, which is also included in it, is "The wicked have injured the earth. Poets know all about it. Only poets can save the earth from extinction." So I do think there is this very, and there's something very, very strong about poetry, and I think there's a reason, I mean, from Fule onwards and maybe going back to Tukaram, but basically this poetry, which I think also has, has so much appeal and so much, and also that it's often, I mean, maybe not Namdev Desal, but so often read aloud, performed as song, performed in groups. I think that's also, it can be its own kind of sociality, and it's its own kind of joining together. Yeah, I think this this question of moment one and moment two is really important, and I guess for me it's been kind of like what do then those moments sort of set into motion, because of course then there's many more moments, and I think what's interesting also is that, I mean, this case then, so basically some Brahmins in the town file an injunction to keep people from to keep on quote unquote untouchables from going to the tank, which is granted, temporary injunction. Basically, this case is in court for a decade and goes all the way up to the Bombay High Court. And before it even ends, maybe before and Ambedkar wins, I mean, he's a lawyer, he argues this case. But before that, in 1935, I believe, he calls off the Satyagraha. He's just kind of disgusted with what the response has been. So I think there's, I mean, maybe this is a very broad way of answering, but even thinking of legal frameworks, Ambedkar is always working within the law, but also outside, and also being frustrated with it and in its limitations. So I think not giving up on the law, certainly, and certainly pushing for that. And I mean, some of the most kind of dedicated activists I met in Mahad were lawyers. So that spirit is very much alive, but also realizing that the law will never be kind of the answer.
Absolutely. No, and he uses all of those as kind of test cases, right? And he's very explicit about it, with the temple entry satyagraha. He says, look, I have no interest in going into a Hindu temple and actually, I'm not investing myself in all of the appurtenances of, what, providing worship at the temple would mean. This is a test case for me of a civic right. So he also alters the framework, right, in which these debates are being cast. So I think you're absolutely right on that. Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt, but yeah.
Yeah, I know. And then just, I mean, to this question that Giannis had asked, I mean, obviously it's extremely complicated, but I also don't think it has to be one answer, that there's one exploiter. And I think, I mean, for instance, this is getting into a whole other debate, but the debate between Indian communists and Ambedkarites, for instance, was in some part around this. Who is the exploiter? Is it the capitalist or is it the Brahmin? And this thought that there's one answer to this question, I think, is very dangerous. And I think, I mean, for me, what a sort of reading of Ambedkar gives us is, I mean, he says in a very famous speech that our two enemies are Brahmanism and capitalism. But of course, it doesn't have to be two, and it's very complicated, especially in Maharashtra, how the sort of what you call the middle castes, which way they swing. I mean, are they exploiters or are they exploited? And I think if you want to build a broad-based movement, those groups have to be part of it, even though you could say that they are carrying out most of the atrocities against Dalits. So I think these middle positions are extremely important, which is why, I mean, I would also point to figures like Phule, a generation before Ambedkar. But I think, yeah, I mean, that's a short, not totally adequate answer, but I think those are some of the lines I would think along.
Thank you, Prakash.
Yeah, so on the question on the screen, in the broader neoliberalized universe, I think all of us in Global North bear some responsibility of the exploitation happening in parts of Global South. At the same time, I think it would be extremely important to exercise some caution in not sort of falling into the traps of individualizing responsibility and guilt. Because at the end of the day, there's a structure, and that structure is, not everybody has the ability to shape the structure. So I think with that understanding, we of course bear some responsibility, but the larger question is, how do we change the structures that, you have the Rana Plaza in Dhaka with, 1,127 people died, and there was all kinds of global hue and cry. And, after 20 years of that, or 15 years, very little had changed actually. And so, I think we have a global economic order that is simply unresponsive to any kind of misery and dehumanization of people in different parts of the world. And so in that sense, I think there's a big question, and that's an ongoing question, which made more stark by the ongoing developments in Gaza and so forth. I wanted to really build on your comment, Anupama, about the sort of, the link between community mobilization and scaling up. I think that's really a very central question. And I'm thankful to you that, because I critique the community-based organization and community-based interventions on the one hand, but ended up showing something that sounded like community-based, right? So I think it's important to clarify that. And it's also really fruitful to bring on the discussions of accumulation by dispossession. One big problem with Marxism, as it is being practiced in many cases, not always, is that it takes that sort of capitalist suprastructure as sort of given, and it takes the state as the handmaiden of capitalism, unless the state can be captured by the proletariat. There's no sense of the process through which the social agency is reflected in states of different kinds. And so I would argue that comparable to the spatialization of dispossession and accumulation, we also need to think about the fact that it is political and economic differentiation that is directly producing those geographies of dispossession and accumulation, right? And so this is evident in the context of the land grab that's been going on under the neoliberal reforms in India. And Michael Levian's work shows how that process of dispossession happened actively through the ongoing economic and political processes. And so I think that really is a project, because when we see those policy frameworks, it doesn't quite easily relate to these questions of caste and social marginalization. And I think we need to do more collaborative kind of writings to make sure that we can make those connections more visible, and use those opportunities to then shed light on this kind of dual material relational nature of dispossessions and the outcomes that it generates. So in that sense, I think I got I at least got one project from this talk to follow up in near future. And it's absolutely this interconnectedness of spatialization of dispossession and different political and economic differentiation that is worth sort of looking into.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. It's something that, Thomas also brought up, by talking about sort of the middle castes, right? The muddle in the middle, as it were, and that keeps changing. It's historically contingent, but I think, also what maybe both of you are suggesting, and you've just said it, Prakash, is that, there is a tremendous transformation. We can use the kind of Polanyi-esque, discourse around, a really great transition and a transformation, that what is happening to the politics of land, its relationship to labor, the fact that we've had nearly 2 decades of, jobless growth. And I think I like very much the way in which you've posed it, that there's a kind of spatialization or a respatialization of geographies of dispossession on the one hand, but you have to think about what's happening then to social and political differentiation, which means that perhaps one has to, and I'll go back to something that I think Thomas also was mentioning, which is the old debate between the Ambedkarites and the communists, but that's the debate about caste and class. And what is the kind of, contingent yet contemporary relationship between caste and class. In the meantime, I've got 2 questions up on the screen from Q&A. One is Panu Hejmadi. Hi, Panu. Elite formations of environmentalism in India and elsewhere often tend to use language to refer to environmental justice that has also been used to legitimize caste hierarchies. Thinking of words like pollution, the glorification of village communal life, and the work of scholars like Ram Guha, Madhav Gadgil, etc. In what ways might reading the Mahad Satyagraha as a climate justice movement intervene into that language that we use to talk about environmental justice in South Asia? So do we actually need a new lexicon and a new grammar if we're going to think about it? And the other by Janelle Drone is I think just a comment and an appreciation, Prakash, for your scholarship and for introducing and including Ruthie Wilson Gilmore's work and other women of the caste movement, to bringing up, Gail's name and mention, and yes, indeed, her long-standing work with the Shetkari, with the Sharad Joshi, Combine and beyond, and very much being one of the people who was deeply involved in women's ownership rights, right, at a local level, demanding that women be owners of land, but also thinking about this question of environment and caste and social justice on a more localized scale. But I wonder if one or the other of you would like to respond to Panu. Thomas, do you have a thought on that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I do think, I just absolutely agree that is very much needed. And I think that process is starting. I mean, books like Mukul Sharma writing about caste in nature, Professor Malini Ranganathan and the work she's doing around political ecology of caste, and many others. So I think this is starting to happen, at least in academic spaces, and I think also in some movement spaces. One kind of caveat, maybe it's just because I've been kind of immersed in the Buddha and his Dhamma, preparing for this, but Ambedkar has this very interesting section of how similarities in terminology conceal fundamental difference. So he's talking about Buddhist notions of karma versus Brahmanical ones, for instance. So I think maybe the word pollution, it's true, it's extremely loaded. But I think maybe some of these words are with us from the environmental movement. And so the question is, how do we bring to the fore those fundamental differences in how those words are used? But I also do think, in addition to that, different vocabularies, and I do think precisely people like Gail Ambedkar, Bharat Patankar, these are people who really are extremely attentive to environmental issues. And I think part of this is also due to their very kind of deep imbibing of Jyotirao Phule's work. But I think this is happening. It's not that this is not there. It's that it's not in the narrative of the mainstream environmental movement. And it's how does that build, which is an open question.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, just thinking about things like, social hygiene and so forth, right? So that kind of scientism that's actually, euphemizing, or perhaps it's the mediator coming to this question of, what's the relationship between the apparent similarities between these terms. But I think, yeah, it's, if we were to think about a new set of terms, a new set of terminologies, what are the kinds of things that we would be thinking about, and are there other ways to think about a kind of critical framework through which we could both, indict ongoing forms of historical discrimination presented as forms of spatial, or we could say, environmental toxicity and so forth, right? That the land itself is speaking to this long history of kind of injustice and inequity and kind of spatialization, a dividing and an enclosure, a set of enclosures. But Prakash, please.
Yeah, to add on to this, I come from a sort of almost like a positivist policy research background. And many a times, in addition to being sort of critically aware of the language we use, sometimes it is also just plain and simple doing sort of proper research and, paying attention to what's actually happening on the ground. And so I'll give you one example. And there's a beautiful poem in the book Climate Justice in India about caste and how researchers run into caste all the time in their routine functioning as researchers. When you conduct survey, you do field research, caste is all around you. But Pranita Mudaliar, who wrote that poem, says that, but it never appears in most of the research reports and documents. And why is that, right? And so part of this is almost like, I wouldn't say deliberate, but almost a very real closing of our eyes and ears to the part of reality that does exist. And I'll give you another sort of really quick example. Way before I started my PhD, I was asked to review a book on commons by a professor at JNU or Delhi School. And it was about commons and village commons. And, that was the time when I had no awareness of, these kinds of critical questions of caste and inequality. But simply because I knew the commons and I knew that this was a deeply casteist question of who gets to encroach on the land and whose land encroachments are regularized versus who are thrown out of the commons, I could see that the professor was either not conducting field research or they chose to not write about the caste element of it, right? So part of it is also being sort of sometimes when we I think part of it is also being good, diligent, empirical researcher. That helps a lot, in addition to continuing to think critically about the questions of, language and vocabulary and what it implies. Another quick example, there was long back, there was a national, this is from the 80s, mid 80s, I think, national movement against an old forest law that was being imposed by the Congress government. And there was a proposal to say that people who live on, along the urban areas, boundary between forest and urban areas, they should be allowed to develop forest-based enterprises. But people who live in the forest, they should be allowed subsistence benefits. So when you see something like that, there's like obvious discrepancy, right? What allows some people to make economic exploitation of resource versus others who are asked to actually continue to be in the subsistence mode, So that, field researchers come across these kinds of things all the time.
Yeah, no, thank you very, very much. Maybe this is a good moment to end. We are also getting over time, but this has been an amazing, set of conversations, for talks, conversations actually in the series. And I really wanted to thank Deepali for putting this together and for working with us to make this happen. This really has been her heavy lift and her inspiration in terms of bringing people together. So I'm deeply, deeply grateful to her and to Vincent, who really just has been spectacular in organizing and managing folks. There's a question, maybe a request as well, a final one, and I'll just throw it open to folks. Are slides available? I wish to reread civil rights comparison, please. Maybe if Janelle could write to you, Prakash, to
Sure.
ask for that, yeah? And I'm sure you could find Prakash's email quite easily at Brandeis, and we could do that. This conversation, of course, is being recorded and it will be up shortly as well, Janelle, but if you wanted more granular information and data, I think it might be best to get in touch with Prakash on that. I'd like to thank you both, Prakash and Thomas, for being part of this final series. And I'd like to also end by, remembering and recalling Mahad, which is an extraordinary struggle for human rights, a civil, a movement of a kind of civil disobedience that doesn't fall into the rubric of, Gandhian nationalism, which actually falls outside of it, but it is inaugural, right, in bringing people together and producing the notion of a collectivity that can actually participate and engage. And I think, coming back to what Thomas said, that, it's something both so basic and so intensely human, right? So this idea of a kind of, sociality around the right to access water, to touch it, to physically touch it and come to a tank that you pass every day, but to actually have a chance to touch it. So that intimacy of, the water satyagraha, but also its, historic reverberations, right? As kind of inaugurating the broader Ambedkarite movement, which is still with us today. So Jai Bhim, actually, to everybody, and thank you for joining us. And thanks again, Deepali and Vincent.